Welcome to Learning English Every Day. My name is David. I am 30 years old. I live in a city made of hard concrete, cold steel, and gray glass. In my city, the sun is often hidden behind the smoke and the shadows of tall buildings. The buildings are like giants that never sleep. People move like water in a fast and dangerous river. They are always running. They are always looking at their watches. They are always chasing a future that never seems to arrive. I am a ghost in this city. I am a freelance writer. I work from a small, dark apartment on the third floor of an old, tired building. The walls are thin, and they hold the secrets of many years. The air inside always smells of old dust, stale air, and cold coffee. I don't have many friends. I don't have a family to call at night. My only friends are the characters in the stories I write. I live in a world made of ink and imagination. My window looks out at a brick wall. I cannot see the trees. I cannot see the stars. I can only see the flickering neon lights of a laundry shop across the alley. My world is the white, glowing screen of my laptop. Click-clack, click-clack. That is the only sound I make for many hours, every single day. The building where I live is like a beehive. It is full of people, but we are all islands in a cold sea. I can hear my neighbor on the left, watching loud television news. I can hear the young couple on the right arguing about money and bills. I can hear the heavy, tired footsteps of people in the hallway. We are so close to each other, but we are miles apart in our hearts. I felt like a man standing alone in a desert made of millions of people. I felt like if I disappeared tomorrow, the city would not even blink. I would just be a name on a piece of paper that someone throws away. I would just be a silent room in a very loud building. I told myself I was happy this way. I told myself I liked the solitude and the quiet. But the truth is, I was waiting for something. I was waiting for a sign that I was still a human being. I was waiting for a sound that wasn't a machine or an argument. The sign arrived in the middle of a very rainy Tuesday. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The city was finally becoming quiet. The cars had stopped screaming on the wet streets. The televisions in the building were finally turned off. I was sitting at my small, scratched wooden table. I was trying to finish a story about a man who lost his way. My head felt heavy and my eyes were burning. My heart felt like a dry well with no water left. Suddenly, a sound traveled through the thin ceiling from the apartment above. It was a thin, high sound. It was soft, but it cut through the silence like a sharp silver wire. It was an out-of-tune violin. The melody was slow, like a tired traveler. The melody was incredibly, painfully sad. It did not sound like the polished music from a concert hall. It sounded like a person crying in the total darkness. It sounded like a heart that was breaking, one note at a time, sliding, weeping, sharp, soft. I stopped typing immediately. My fingers stayed frozen over the keys. I looked up at the stained white ceiling. Who is playing a violin at 2 a.m.? I whispered to the empty room. At first, I felt a flash of hot anger. I was tired from 10 hours of work. I was stressed about my rent. I didn't need a crying violin to keep me awake. I stood up and grabbed a heavy dictionary from the shelf. I wanted to hit the ceiling with the book. I wanted to shout, "Shut up! Some people are trying to survive here." But as I raised my arm, the music changed. The notes became even softer, almost like a whisper. The violin began to play a lullaby for a world that has no mother, a lullaby for the lonely, the lost, and the broken souls. I felt my arm go weak. The heavy book fell back onto the table with a soft thud. I sat back down in my hard chair. The anger in my chest was gone in a second. In its place, There was a strange, cold warmth. I realized that I knew this feeling very well. I knew the pain that lived inside those notes. The person upstairs was not trying to be annoying. The person upstairs was not practicing for a show. They were just trying to survive the night, just like me. They were talking to the darkness because they had no one else to talk to. And for the first time in many years, I was truly listening. The next night, I did something I had never done before. I didn't wait for my work to finish. I finished my writing early at 1:30 a.m. I made a cup of hot chamomile tea. I turned off all the artificial lights in my apartment. I sat on the wooden floor, leaning my back against the cold wall. I watched the green digital clock on my oven. 1:58, 1:59. Exactly at 2 a.m., the music began. It was the same violin. It was the same sad, beautiful, and broken voice. The music did not have a name. It was a song of long shadows. It was a song of 1,000 lonely nights in this city. I closed my eyes and let the notes flow over me like water. I felt like I was no longer in a small, cheap apartment. I felt like I was floating on a dark ocean under a million bright stars. The violin told me stories that I could never write. It told me about a woman waiting at a train station for a train that never comes. It told me about an old man who lost his way in the woods, but found a flower. It told me that it was okay to be sad in a world that demands a smile. It told me that it was okay to be alone in a city of stone. Every note felt like a gentle hand reaching through the wall to touch mine. I hear you, the music seemed to say to me. I feel what you feel, the violin whispered into the night. I realized that I wasn't just listening to music. I was having a deep conversation with a stranger. I was part of a secret club of only 2 people. We were the only ones awake in the whole concrete desert. I began to imagine the person who lived in apartment 402. In my mind, I thought it was a young woman with long, dark hair. I thought she was a music student who practiced at night because she was too shy to play in the sun. I thought she was beautiful, fragile, and full of secrets. Or maybe it was an old, lonely man. A man who had lost his wife 50 years ago and only had this old violin left. A man who played for his memories of a time when he was loved. I didn't know their face. I didn't know their name. But I knew their soul better than any person on the street. This became my new ritual, my reason to wake up. I lived my whole day just for 2 a.m. I lived for the sound of that silver wire cutting the silence. I felt less like a machine made of tasks. I felt more like a human being with a beating heart. I started to write again, but my stories were completely different. They were no longer cold and gray. They were full of the music and the shadows from the ceiling. I thought this connection would last forever. I thought the violin would always be there to hold my hand in the dark. I was wrong. I did not know that the most beautiful songs always have a sudden ending. And I did not know that the silence coming was more terrifying than any noise I had ever heard. The weeks passed, like slow, heavy clouds in a long summer sky. But my nights were no longer empty, dark, and cold. My nights were full of silver wires, invisible hands, and secret hope. The relationship between apartment 302 and apartment 402 grew stronger every single day. We never met in the narrow, dim hallway of our building. We never saw each other at the metal mailboxes downstairs in the lobby. We were like 2 ghosts living in the same giant house made of stone and secrets. But every night, at 2 a.m., we were the most connected people in this entire city. I started to feel that the music was not just a beautiful coincidence. I felt that the violin was waiting for me, just as I was waiting for it. I felt that the person upstairs could hear the heavy silence of my own room. One night, as the music played a particularly beautiful and slow note, I did something very brave. The note was high and thin, like a single bird singing alone in the cold rain. I reached out my hand and touched the cold white wallpaper of my ceiling. I could feel the tiny, delicate vibrations of the music in my fingertips. It felt like a heartbeat traveling through the hard concrete. It felt like the steady pulse of a living, breathing friend. I lifted my hand and tapped on the hard wall 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath until my lungs felt tight and my chest ached. The music stopped immediately, as if the violin had been struck by a sudden lightning bolt. The silence that followed was so sudden, it felt like a physical blow to my face. My heart pounded in my ears like a heavy drum in a quiet forest. I thought, I have ruined the magic forever. I have scared them away with my human noise. I waited for 1 long minute, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall. I waited for 2 long minutes, feeling the cold sweat on my palms. And then, it finally happened. From the ceiling above, there were 3 soft rhythmic taps in return. Tap, tap, tap. A warm wave of pure joy crashed over me like the ocean. It was a hello, sent from the deep darkness. It was an acknowledgement of my existence in this big world. The violin began to play again, but the melody was completely different now. It was no longer a crying lullaby for the lost and the broken. It was a song of friendship and shared secrets across a wall. It was a song that said, I know you are there, and I am here too. I closed my eyes and smiled into the deep darkness of my small room. I am not an island anymore. I whispered to the empty air. I have a friend in the sky, and we speak through the language of stone. In the quiet garden of my mind, I began to build a life for the person upstairs. I did not want to see their face, so I created a face for them. I named him the Maestro. I imagined he was a very old man who wore a velvet housecoat the color of old wine. I thought he had a room full of tall green plants and old gold-framed paintings. I thought he had a cat with yellow eyes that slept on the piano while he played. I imagined him standing by a large window, looking at the same stars I saw every night. I started to buy better tea, the kind of tea a real maestro would drink at midnight. I started to keep my apartment cleaner, as if he could see my soul through the ceiling. My own writing became faster, stronger, and much more powerful than before. I was no longer writing stories about ghosts and gray, lonely cities. I was writing about the invisible threads that connect human hearts across time and space. I was writing about the music that lives in the long, heavy silence between people. Every night followed the same beautiful and sacred ritual. 1:30 a.m. My tea is ready, steaming in the cup, smelling of mountains. 1:45 a.m. All the artificial lights in my apartment go out, one by one. 1:59 a.m. My palm is resting gently against the cold, hard wall. 2 a.m. The silver wire begins to sing its ancient and honest song. We created a secret language made of small taps and long vibrations. 1 tap meant, I am here, and I am listening to every note. 2 taps meant, that note was beautiful, thank you for sharing it. 3 taps meant, good night, my friend. See you in the next dream. It was the most honest and pure relationship of my entire life. There were no lies to tell in the dark. There were no masks to wear for the world to see. There was only the truth of the music and the vibration of the stone wall. I felt safe for the first time in many years. I felt like the cruel city could not hurt me as long as the maestro was there. I thought we would do this for 10, 20, or even 50 years. I thought we would grow old together, separated by only 6 inches of concrete. But the world is not a song that never ends. And sometimes, the most important voices are the ones that stop without a single warning. It was a cold, bitter Monday night in the middle of a dark February. The wind was howling outside my window like a hungry and wounded animal. A great storm was coming from the ocean, and the city felt nervous and tight. I finished my writing work early that night because I was excited. I had written a beautiful story about a violin that could talk to the winter birds. I wanted to share my new energy and my secret joy with the maestro. I sat on the wooden floor at 1:55 a.m., waiting for the magic moment. I watched the green glowing numbers on my digital clock. 1:56, 1:57, 1:58. I put my palm flat against the wall, feeling the biting coldness of the stone. 1:59. I waited for the first high, crying note to pierce the darkness. I waited for the sound of the wooden bow crossing the silver strings. 2. Nothing happened. The silence was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. I thought, maybe his clock is just a few minutes slow tonight because of the storm. I waited 5 minutes, my eyes fixed on the green numbers of the clock. The clock showed 2:05 a.m., but the room was still as a fresh grave. I tapped on the wall 3 times, a little harder than I usually did. Tap, tap, tap. I waited for the answer. I waited for the vibration. I waited for the song. No one tapped back from the room above. The ceiling was dead, and the stone was cold like ice. I felt a small, dark seed of fear start to grow in the bottom of my stomach. He must be very tired tonight, I told myself with a shaky and thin voice. Or maybe he is sick and needs to rest his tired arms. I waited until 3 a.m., sitting in the freezing dark with my heavy coat on. But the silver wire did not sing a single note into the night. The only sound was the screaming wind and the ticking of my own watch. Tick, tick, tick. I went to bed at 4 a.m., but I did not close my eyes for a second. I listened to the terrifying and empty silence of the ceiling above me. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like a thick, wet blanket. It was a silence that felt like a secret I was afraid to know. The next night was exactly the same as the night before. Exactly at 2 a.m., I was there on the floor, begging the cold wall. I was whispering to the ceiling, "Please, just one note, just a hello." But the maestro stayed silent, and the wall stayed cold and dead. I started to imagine terrible things. I thought of him lying on the floor, unable to reach his violin. I thought of him leaving the city forever, without saying goodbye to me. On the second night, I finally went out into the hallway. I walked up the stairs to the 4th floor, my heart pounding in my throat. I stood outside apartment 402. The door was a dark, heavy green, covered in old, peeling paint. There was no light shining under the door from the inside. There was no smell of cooking, or tea, or even old paper. There was only the smell of old wood and the cold, damp air of the stairs. I raised my hand to knock, my fingers only inches away from the wood, but I stopped myself at the last second. What if I was wrong about everything? What if the person inside didn't want to meet a stranger from downstairs? What if the music was a private, holy thing, and I was breaking into their sanctuary? I walked back to my own apartment, my heart feeling like a heavy stone. On the 3rd night of silence, I couldn't even open my laptop to work. The screen was just a white, blinding wall that mocked my loneliness. I realized then how much I truly and deeply needed that violin. I had built my whole life and my soul around that midnight sound. It was my anchor in the storm of the cruel city. It was the only thing that made me feel like a real human being. Without the music, I was just a ghost in a building full of strangers again. I looked at the ceiling, and for the first time, the silence was terrifying. It wasn't just a lack of sound. It felt like a heavy, dark presence. It felt like something beautiful had died in the middle of the night. It felt like a light had gone out in the middle of a dark forest. I have to know the truth, I said to the empty and dark room. I cannot live another hour in this suffocating and heavy silence. I stood up and grabbed my heavy flashlight. I walked to my door, and I didn't look back at my laptop. I didn't care about the rules of being a stranger anymore. I was going to find the maestro, even if he hated me for it. I was going to find out why the silver wire had stopped singing to me. I didn't know that what I was about to find would shatter my entire world. I didn't know that the music I loved had been a lie for a very long time. The fourth floor of the building was a tomb of shadows. The air was colder here, and it smelled of wet stone and heavy time. I stood in front of the dark green door of apartment 402. My flashlight was shaking in my hand, making the shadows dance like ghosts. I reached out my fingers and I touched the wooden handle. I expected it to be locked. I expected to need a key or a heavy shoulder to break inside. But when I turned the handle, it moved with a soft and slow creak. Creak! The door opened into a world of absolute darkness. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on something dry on the floor. I shined my light around the room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, looking like silent monsters in the night. The air was thick, with 1,000 years of dust. It was the smell of a place where no one had breathed for a very long time. "Maestro?" I whispered, my voice sounding tiny and lost. No one answered. There were no tall plants. There were no gold-framed paintings on the walls. There was only the silence of an empty grave. I walked into the center of the living room. The dust was so thick, it looked like gray snow on the wooden floor. Then, my light hit something in the corner by the window. It was not a man. It was not a young woman with dark hair. It was a large, old-fashioned gramophone sitting on a small wooden table. The machine had a giant golden horn that looked like a dying flower. It was a beautiful and ancient piece of machinery covered in a heavy blanket of dust. Next to the gramophone, there was a black metal box with many wires. It looked like a timer, the kind of machine used to turn on streetlights. The clock on the timer showed exactly 2 a.m. My heart felt like it was falling down a deep, dark hole. I walked to the table and touched the cold metal of the horn. I saw a record resting on the turntable. It was a thick, black disc with no label. I looked at the needle of the gramophone. It was resting at the very end of the record, making a soft scratching sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I realized then the terrible truth of my nights. The music was not live. The silver wire was not singing from a human heart tonight. The maestro was not standing by the window. This machine had been playing the same sad song every night for years. But then, I remembered the taps on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. How could a machine tap back to me? I looked down at the floorboards near the wall. I saw the heavy wooden arm of the old-timer. Every night, when the record finished, the heavy metal arm would drop. Thud, thud, thud. It hit the floor exactly 3 times when the power turned off. To my lonely heart, those thuds sounded like a hello. To my empty soul, those mechanical sounds were a conversation. I had been talking to a machine. I had been building a life for a ghost made of metal and wood. I sat on the dusty floor and I began to cry. I felt like the biggest fool in the world. I felt like the city had finally won, and I was truly alone. As I sat in the dust, my light hit a small object under the table. It was a notebook with a blue leather cover. I picked it up and brushed away the gray dust. The pages were yellow and brittle like old leaves. I opened the first page and saw a name. Julian Thorne, 1974. I turned to the very last entry, dated 10 years ago. The handwriting was shaky and thin, the writing of a man with very little strength left. My name is Julian. The diary began. I was a violinist for the city orchestra for 40 years. But my hands are tired now, and my lungs are full of shadows. The doctors say I have only a few weeks of breath left. I have no children to tell my stories to. I have no wife to hold my hand in the darkness. I am afraid of the silence of this building. I am terrified that when I stop breathing, my music will disappear forever. I am terrified that no one will even know I was here. So, I have made a recording of my favorite lullaby. I have built a timer to play this record every night at 2 a.m. It is my message to the world. It is my way of saying, I am still here. I am still alive. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. But it also means you were listening. It means you stayed awake in the dark with me. Thank you for being my friend in the silence. Thank you for making my music real. For one more night. Please, do not let the silver wire stop singing. I closed the notebook and looked at the gramophone in the moonlight. The scratching sound of the needle continued in the quiet room. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I realized then that I was not a fool. The connection was not a lie. Julian Thorne had reached out his hand from 10 years in the past, and I had reached out my hand from the present. We had met in the middle of the wall, in the middle of the night. The music was not just a recording. It was his soul. His fear of being forgotten was my fear of being alone. He had saved me from the concrete desert, and by listening, I had saved him from being forgotten. We were two strangers who had built a bridge that time could not break. I stood up, and I wiped the tears from my face. I took my flashlight, and I found a small screwdriver in the kitchen drawer. I cleaned the dust from the gramophone with my own shirt. I fixed the needle. I oiled the heavy wooden arm of the timer. I didn't want the music to stop. I wanted the silver wire to sing for another 10 years. I walked back to the table and I did one more thing. I took my pen and I wrote a message on the last page of Julian's diary. I heard you, Julian. I wrote in big, bold letters. I heard every note. You were never alone, and because of you, I will never be alone again. Good night, my friend. See you at 2 a.m. I walked back down the stairs to my own apartment. The building did not feel like a beehive of strangers anymore. It felt like a library of hidden stories waiting to be read. I sat at my laptop and I didn't write about ghosts. I wrote about Julian. I wrote about the golden horn and the secret language of taps. I wrote about the bridge made of music. Exactly at 2 a.m., the sound traveled through the ceiling. It was the same violin. It was the same melancholy melody. But it didn't sound sad to me anymore. It sounded like a victory. It sounded like a promise. I reached out my hand and touched the white wallpaper. I felt the vibration in my skin. Tap, tap, tap. I waited for the thud of the machine. Thud, thud, thud. I smiled, and I closed my eyes. The city was still made of concrete and steel. The rain was still cold on the glass. But the desert was gone. The islands were connected, and the silver wire was singing louder than the storm. I realized that the most beautiful things in life are never really gone. They just wait for a heart that is brave enough to listen.